Hey guys, today we're going to talk about Decca Records. It's a UK-based home label that had a US department, and they were very important during the swing era and the '78 era. They bought up a lot of small little labels and reissued that stuff under the Decca imprint. And as the LP era dawned, they were quick to do the 10-inch and then the 12-inch LP. They had a good swath of jazz like RCA. They're going to have some cutting leading edge white artists and some more throwback safer black artists. They use a few black vocalists that they feel are going to help break the ice, but nothing obviously too risky or even bluesy or gospel. It's more pop and safer mainstream. Not to say there's lots of great titles on Decca, and they launched the Chorale label probably in '53 or '4. Because there's a good series of 10 inches on Chorale even. And it's a lot of that's pretty mass-produced jazz. And I've tried to select out the best of the Chorale label. Some of the good Al Cohn stuff. There's some really good players on there you'll see coming up. And I love the stuff by Georgie Auld on there. Just melancholic, beautiful stuff that it's something you want to play on a rainy night. A balcony over a park. Like it's just got this wonderful feel to it, a lot of that stuff that Georgie Auld does. And I'll point it out when we run through the records that I have. And again, like RCA and like Capitol, there's thousands of records that they're putting out. And the 1000s, sorry, not the 1000, the 4000 series. They eventually started an 8000 series for some throwback stuff. I hope I don't have those numbers backwards, but I think it's correct. And then the 4000 series comes to an abrupt end because they run out of numbers, and they jump these titles onto the 8000 series because it was already a 9000 series, and the 9200 series has some really good stuff in it as well. Sorry, that's Decca. It's good stuff. And then Brunswick was another label that they kind of were loosely affiliated with, but the records are, and the artists are fairly interchangeable between Chorale, Brunswick, and Decca. So it's some really good stuff here. So put your seatbelt on and enjoy. We'll flip through those records, and you all can tell me what you think and feel about it. All right, everybody, how are we doing today? We're looking at the Decca catalog here. These are some early 10 inches, some Armstrong Tatum. It's not going to look too different from what RCA or what Capitol or even Columbia are doing. Some old Jimmy Lunsford again from the old days. Peggy Lee from the 40s. Some Andy Kirk on Chorale, which is, of course, is the sister label. Here's some more Chorale. Les Brown and his band of renown. Some great Neil Hefti early stuff. And then fantastic Georgie Auld, who to me is one of the great unsung tenormen. Some early Ellington Brunswick 10 inches. Some Johnny Dodds New Orleans. Fantastic player who was kind of forgotten today, sadly. King Oliver, more New Orleans, Joe Flip Phillips, who worked a lot for Norman Granz, the young Tony Scott, who ends up doing the kind of meditational stuff later in the 60s. Now we're in the LP era. This early Decca with Charlie Ventura, brought by Gene Norman, which is kind of interesting. Some Count Basie stuff. Again, it's hard to always know what the heritage of some of these recordings are. Jazz Studio 2. Some of the Jazz Studio series stuff's really good. Lionel Hampton stuff, nice early recordings from him. Some more fantastic Peggy Lee, a great Coleman Hawkins record. And Sammy Davis, who was like Decca's Nat Cole or Harry Belafonte. Some early Benny Green and Paul Kinnish. I think those were both 10 inches at one point. Sylvia Sims, kind of a forgotten singer. Some more great Satchmo. Lady Holiday, Lady Sings the Blues. More great Lionel Hampton, some Carmen McRae early work by her. She's kind of another one of those singers we don't think about enough. Ellis Larkin, one of my favorite piano pianists from the era. He's a black guy who records on a lot of stuff and doesn't get a lot of fame, but he's really an important player. Sammy Davis, some more great Peggy Lee, which was originally a 10-inch. More Ella Fitzgerald singing Gershwin. Then we got some fantastic stuff here by the great Al Hibbler, who was renowned for singing on Ellington stuff in the 40s. Great John Gross, the Iowan, who is a great French hornist. One of the great soundtracks of all time there. Conley Craves, another forgotten piano player, has some work on Nocturne as well. I think it's more Sylvia Sims and Carmen McRae. So you see kind of the series as it's unfolding here, 86, 76, Sammy Davis, more John Gross, more Billie Holiday. It's pretty safe. It's good stuff, but they're certainly not risking anything here with 4188 Earl Grant. That's no Jimmy Smith. He's playing a fairly gospel organ there. I love Sal Salvador. That's not my favorite recording by him, but for sure. Some more early Satchmo from the 20s there with the hot 5s and 7s. Great Sam Taylor, who his best stuff's probably at MGM, but his stuff here at Decca is also fantastic. That's a great Sam Taylor record there. Al Cooper stuff. We're jumping now to the 4000 sequence. And they started tacking stuff on this sequence at one point because they ran out of numbers in the other sequence. More early Peggy Lee. Her Capitol stuff's really famous, but her Decca stuff's good as well. Billie Holiday compilation, Ellington in Canada. You know, it's a really fantastic label. As you can see, some of the stuff here, some later kind of compilation stuff here that's being put out. Holiday stuff's always worth grabbing when you see it. That's just a rule of thumb for me. This is the 9200 sequence now. They're all animals here for a little bit. Barry Galbraith, Earl Grant, Fred Katz. The animal covers are cool. This is a kind of a jazz-specific series, 9200. 20 titles long. Toots Thielman, Johnny Pisano, and Billy Bean, the great guitarist. Ralph Burns, the great arranger. Don Elliott, the great mellophone player. Hal McCusick, more Sal Salvador with brass. Again, I'm a pretty big Sal Salvador fan. I love his Bethlehem work. Ellis Larkins, the pianist we mentioned. More Pisano and Bean, guitar players. 4, 5, and 6 is Fred Katz with Hal Gaylor and Johnny Pisano. These are nice records. The George Russell's fairly important stuff. Fred Katz and his jammers, the Katz and Jammers. Fred Katz plays with Chico Hamilton and that great quintet for a while. These are both very important George Russell records in the space age and at the 5 spot. Probably some of the most expensive Decca jazz records you'll have to try to get. Now we're looking at Chorale here. Some more Georgie Hall, Got You Under My Skin, Mel Torme. Some Steve Allen jazz for tonight. The Steve Allen went on to have a TV show at one point. I was early Mel Torme. Lullaby of Broadway, gorgeous Georgie Hall. Misty's gorgeous. Edgar Sampson's fantastic. Great swing band leader, composer, arranger. That jazz septet's an incredible record with an incredible lineup. The Hal McCusick there on the bottom is also a fantastic record. The Joe Newman stuff, Al Cohn stuff. This is Anthony Ortega with, I believe it's Nat Pierce, who was a bass pianist and arranger at times. More Hal McCusick, more Manny Albarn, the jazz greats of our time. Al Conan's at Sims. So again, we're seeing similar kind of things where it's great white players. Bill Holman, who has stuff at Capitol. You'll see Joe Newman, again, who had stuff at RCA. More of the Jazz Great series. It's a lot of the white cool cats. The great Eddie Costa, one of his few solo records, even though he was on hundreds of side projects. Tony Scott again. And then that's Mercer Ellington, one of Duke's children. Marianne McCall, who I like some of her stuff with Charlie Ventura. That's not her best record, but it's still good. Teddy King, Johnny Richards, a great arranger who worked with Stan Kenton. Art Tatum, of course, this is now Brunswick stuff. Skylark by Jackie Paris is fantastic. Basie's in the bag, more Al Hibbler. And so these little sub-labels are all pretty fantastic little examples of what the Decca Brunswick Chorale family was about. So I hope you all enjoyed that little run through. I've actually added quite a few Decca, Capitol, and RCA titles the last couple weeks. You can get some of them really cheap, so I stocked up on a few things. I'll add those on one of these episodes coming up. You can see some stuff I've added. A lot of Armstrong stuff on Decca, just titles that for a few bucks I might as well plug those in just to have that history. And that's kind of what these episodes are about, is talking about the history of the music. And if you know your chronology and your timelines, you'll see how not progressive, not in tune with what's happening, these major labels are. That's not to say they're not doing some fantastic stuff, because they are. But, I mean, you look at Atlantic in 1956 doing Pithecanthropus erectus by Charlie Mingus. You can tell Atlantic's not on the big stage quite yet. I mean, they're getting there. Atlantic's about to be on the big stage, but they're not there yet. because they're willing to do some really risky stuff. Ornette Coleman, John Coltrane, Atlantic's really going to push the envelope. And these labels aren't willing to really kind of go that extra mile. They will feature a few black artists that they feel comfortable with. I mean, a guy like Joe Newman's really inoffensive, and he's, he's not an aggressive personality. He's not channeling social rights and civil rights, and he's not making political commentaries in his titles of his songs. So he's going to be a figure we feel is a commodity we can use. We can use the old cats that are black from the 30s and the 40s and the 20s, because the people who are old and would judge us are going to remember those artists from their childhood, and they're probably okay with Basie and Ellington and Armstrong at this point. They're probably not afraid of Holiday and Fitzgerald at this point, but it's a whole different ballgame when you start talking about the post-bop, hard bop movement. And you have to remember that's what's happening simultaneously to what we're showing you. These 10 inches are early 50s, 54, 55 when they switched to the LPs. And at that point, Monk's gone to Riverside. The modernity's really churning over there. Pithecanthropus erectus is happening at Atlantic. Blue Notes launching into the Johnny Griffins and the Horace Silvers and the Jazz Messengers, and that aggressive new pulsing sound is prevalent in the underground little black labels, but they're not in any way being allowed that coverage on the major labels. It was a distance away. Even at Emerson in Chicago, the Clifford Brown Max Roach Quintet in 54-55, that's some cutting edge stuff. And the closest we really get, as we'll see when we get to Columbia, is the Miles Davis, John Coltrane First Great Quintet, which Columbia takes that gamble when they hear Miles at Newport in 55. I think it was 55. Miles was kind of directionless at that point. And he signed with Columbia, and he wraps up his contract with Prestige, making the famous Working, Cooking, Steaming, Relaxing sessions. And he kind of gets out of that Prestige contract as quick as he can. He's already starting to record for Columbia a year before he actually can get out of his contract and have his Columbia stuff put out. So Columbia's kind of taken that leap, and they'll follow that up shortly with doing some Donald Byrd, Horace Silver stuff, and the Jazz Messenger records that they do. But again, it's Columbia's willing to kind of to be that prodigal son and take that chance. But Decca, Capitol, and RCA is certainly lagging behind here in 56, 57, 58. And we're kind of following these labels into the 60s. And you're not seeing any of the innovations of the avant-garde really showing up at all. Free jazz is miles away from what all these labels are doing. The hard bop, aggressive, the commentary that's social, the political kind of undercurrents of a lot of what was happening at those small labels is just not present on these big labels. And you need that time scope, that chronology to really see how different, how big the gap is between what the major labels are putting out there and what the small labels are doing under the ground, under the surface. And it's boiling up, and it's catching fire because the West Coast White Cats are playing it. They're like, oh, shit. Yeah, we're going to step to that. Charlie Mariano, Stu Williamson, those guys are like, pfft. I mean, Shorty Rogers has fire. Even guys like Maynard Ferguson, those guys are breathing fire. They're electric. They're hearing what Clifford Brown's doing. They're loving Lee Morgan's tenacity. They're loving Clifford Brown's just bravura and his absolute roller coaster of sound. They love the rolling thunder of the Jazz Messengers. And they do a great job trying to capture and embody some of that. But again, it just escapes them on some level. The label's not going to really allow them to get too socially conscious with anything they're doing. So even the lyric content is going to be kind of, by lyric I mean the titles of the songs and stuff, everything's going to be quite innocuous in terms of how it's labeled and what it's called. And you can tell that the White Cats on the West Coast are hearing that stuff, and they're kind of making references to it. But it's a long way from those guys being allowed to come in the studio and record that stuff themselves. And so, again, it's just an interesting thing to look at, the gap. And remember when I talked about the voters for the Playboy magazines, the Downbeat magazines, it's this Decca, Columbia, Capital, RCA world that the mass people who voted for those people in those magazines are going to have heard. If you're living in Jefferson City, Missouri, you don't get Blue Note, you don't get Riverside, you don't get Prestige, you don't get Savoy. You may see the odd Mercury, Emercy, because that's right down the pipeline because they have plants in St. Louis and Chicago. And those two, Emercy and Mercury, grew into a pretty big label pretty fast, kind of like Atlantic does. Atlantic's having success with their R&B stuff, especially in their 8000 series, which has given them some license to be pretty creative in the 1200 series at Atlantic. And the Atlantic 1200 series is incredible, but it runs a wide range of sounds. We should probably do an episode on Atlantic soon coming up. It's a much more important label than people give them credit for. Impulse is still years away from coming to existence. We talked about the big film studios recently, MGM, ABC, United Artists, Warner Brothers. The jazz they're putting out is more in lockstep with this than it is with leading underground black labels. And even the labels like Storyville out of Boston and Transition out of Boston, those labels are doing some pretty cutting edge, hard, Dawn, Bethlehem. These labels, and those were wider labels, but they're still doing stuff that's a little bit more risky. The art at Bethlehem was risky. The Roos label is light years ahead of what's happening here. And then you have Verve. And Verve kind of exists in this no man's land between the small indies and between the large, massive labels. Verve wasn't really either. Norman Granz initially was having his stuff printed by Mercury, and Mercury had fairly good distribution, as I just mentioned. Before that, they had labels like Stinson pressing his earliest stuff. So the earliest Norman Granz stuff, even though it's Norman Granz and even though it's his, it's being pressed by other labels, which is interesting. There was a few other labels, an Atch, it's a weird spelled label. They did some of the early stuff for Norman Granz, but eventually he gets the money to do his own Clef series, and then he has Norgran, and then he kind of shuffles that whole deck and transfers it all to the Verve label, which again is incredibly convoluted. And you can find several different covers for the same thing, several years apart even. And then so many of the greats are kind of locked down under contract by Norman. So eventually Billy's there, eventually Ella Fitzgerald's there, eventually Charlie Parker's there, Lester Young is there, Ben Webster's there, Coleman Hawkins is there, Sweets Edison is there, Charlie Ventura is there. So these guys go to Verve, and it's a good middle ground for most of them because they're going to get paid a lot better at Norman Granz and Verve than they would at a Blue Note or at a Savoy. But they won't have the oversight of a Capitol or an RCA kind of impinging on the music I want to play and how black my music is going to be, or how bebop is going to be, or how agitated it might sound. So it's an interesting thing how much the business side of this impacts greatly the sounds of jazz and where jazz is coming from and who knows what. It can't be denied or separated. And people can tell they want that the whites and black hats, they weren't the same. They weren't in the same world. They weren't living in the same conditions. And the labels were still very scared of America's racist lifestyle. They had to be really conscious. And even though a lot of these labels probably weren't filled with racist people themselves, there was still a business model that they had to be aware of and cognizant of, so that they didn't just put out some militant stuff for the middle of the country to get all upset about. And people did get upset, and these were troubled times. There was a lot of conflict. There was, protests and riots, and underneath the surface of that melancholic, bucolic 50s America, there was an agitation stirring. There was a militancy rising, and we see it foment in the 60s. And the Korean War didn't really kind of push things like the Vietnam War did in the 60s into the 70s. So American history, and again, it's just wrapped up in this racial conflict between an oppressed group of people finding freedom and a young white audience finding power in that music that they make and bringing it home, and mom and dad always being scared of it. I mean, 4 generations ago, they thought Duke Ellington was the devil's music. It's just a never-ending loop of what the black culture is doing now. Is a little bit too much for us to process. And so it's just interesting to look at it. I hope you all enjoyed this episode. I'll get back to you real soon. We'll follow this up with the Capitol and look at their great run of stuff. Capitol has a pretty good range of stuff, too. So we'll talk to you all soon. Have a great night. Peace.